Liverpool's gang leaders get talked about like kingpins. Big money, tight crews, untouchable reputations. That's the image everyone carries. But one senior detective who caught one of the city's most notorious killers called his gang something else entirely. Kids with guns. These are Liverpool's most feared gang leaders. Case 1. Tommy Comerford, Top Cat of the Liverpool Docks. Thomas Anthony Comerford was born in Liverpool in the early 1930s. Most people who knew him later in life called him Tacker. Police and the press called him Top Cat. By the time he died in October 2003, at the age of 70, he had spent more than 34 years of his life behind bars. He is remembered today as one of the first men in Liverpool, and one of the first in the whole of England, to turn drug smuggling into an organised, international business. Before any of that, Comerford was just another working man on the Liverpool docks. He drove trucks for a living, hauling goods in and out of one of the busiest ports in the country. The docks were the heartbeat of the city at the time. Ships came in from all over the world carrying cargo, and thousands of men worked the waterfront loading and unloading it. For a young man looking to make extra money outside of an honest wage, the docks offered opportunity. Goods went missing, deals got made in the shadows of warehouses. Comerford started small, as a petty thief, picking up items here and there before working his way into more serious theft and eventually armed robbery. By the early 1960s, Comerford had built a name for himself in the city. He was seen as a man with some standing, someone connected to nightlife venues and willing to use force when it served him. One story that has followed him through the decades involves the Cray twins, the London gangsters who at the time were trying to expand their reach outside the capital. According to accounts passed down by people who covered Comerford's career, he was the man who stopped the Crays from muscling in on Liverpool's rackets, refusing to let outside criminals take a cut of what was happening in his city. Whether that story is remembered exactly the way it happened or has grown in the retelling, it stuck to him for the rest of his life. And it says something about how other criminals in Liverpool saw him even in that early period. He wasn't just a thief, he was becoming someone other criminals had to deal with directly, on his terms, in his city. The event that truly put Comerford on the map came in August 1969. Over a bank holiday weekend, when banks were shut and city centre streets were quiet, Comerford and a group of fellow robbers from the north end of Liverpool broke into a branch of the District Bank on Water Street, right in the heart of the city. They didn't smash a window or pick a lock. They tunneled into the building and used a thermal lance, a tool capable of burning through metal at extremely high temperatures, to cut open the bank's safe. It was one of the earliest known uses of that kind of tool in a British bank robbery, and it showed a level of planning that went beyond a simple smash and grab. The men spent the entire long weekend working on the job, timing it so they would have as many uninterrupted hours as possible before staff returned on the next working day. When it was done, they walked away with more than £140,000 in cash and another £20,000 in property. In today's money, that haul would be worth well over £1 million. For a while, it looked like the robbers had gotten away clean. What eventually undid them was almost accidental. During the robbery, the gang had taken a cigarette case along with the rest of the loot. Comerford is said to have given that case to his own barrister as a gift, with no idea that the gesture would come back to haunt him. Later, at a boxing event held at the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, that same barrister offered a cigarette to a senior police detective, pulling one out of the stolen case. The detective recognized it immediately as an item taken during the Water Street robbery. That single moment, a small act of hospitality at a boxing dinner, unraveled the entire operation. Investigators traced the case back through the barrister to Comerford and the rest of the gang, and arrests followed. In December 1970, Comerford was convicted of burglary at Liverpool and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was already his second criminal conviction, and it meant years of his life spent inside. When Comerford eventually walked free, he made a decision that would define the rest of his criminal career. He turned away from armed robbery and moved into the drug trade. This was a significant shift, not just for him personally, but for organized crime in the city as a whole. Robbery was dangerous, physical work that came with a high chance of violence and a limited payoff. Drugs offered something different, a steady, repeatable source of income, as long as you had the contacts to bring the product in and the network to move it once it arrived. In the late 1970s, Comerford formed what became known as the Liverpool Mafia. It was made up of a group of older, experienced men, mostly white and middle-aged, many of them former armed robbers like Comerford himself, who had made the same switch from stealing money to trafficking narcotics. What made the group effective was their access. Because so many of them had spent years working around the docks, or working with people who did, they had relationships with corrupt port officials who could look the other way when certain shipments came through. They also had, according to reports at the time, some level of protection from corrupt police officers, which made it possible for them to operate for years without being fully dismantled. Using these connections, Comerford's group smuggled large quantities of amphetamine, cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and LSD through the port of Liverpool and out into the wider country. The group's position strengthened further after 1981. That summer, the Toxteth area of Liverpool was the site of serious civil unrest, sparked by tension between police and the local community, much of it rooted in years of racial discrimination and heavy-handed policing of young black residents. In the aftermath of those riots, the Liverpool Mafia built an alliance with younger black gangs operating in the city. This partnership expanded the reach of Comerford's operation and, according to reporting on organised crime in the city from that period, helped make the group the richest criminal organisation in the United Kingdom at the time. Comerford's own role in the drug trade did not stay behind the scenes for long. He put together a crew that included 4 dockers to help collect a shipment of cannabis being brought in from North Africa. It was an ambitious plan that relied on the same kind of dockside access that had made his earlier robbery career possible. But the Merseyside Police Drug Squad had picked up on the operation, and officers carried out a stakeout that caught Comerford and his associates in the act. He was tried and convicted, receiving a 7-year prison sentence at Liverpool Crown Court. On appeal, that sentence was reduced to 4 years, a reduction that still let him return to the streets years earlier than the original sentence would have allowed. Throughout this period, Comerford lived a lifestyle that stood out sharply against his official financial situation. He was known around the city as a larger-than-life character from the Scotland Road area, a man who dressed in expensive suits, wore costly watches, and was a regular face at boxing dinners and at the Grand National Horse Race. At the same time, and this detail became one of the most talked-about parts of his story, he held onto a council flat on Lee Vale Road and continued collecting regular payments from the Department of Health and Social Security, the government body responsible for benefits at the time. He was, on paper, a man in financial need. In reality, he was also living in a separate, far more comfortable bungalow on Station Road in the Gateacre area of the city. In 1983, he and his wife flew to New York and boarded the Queen Elizabeth II for a winter cruise that cost close to £5,000, a huge sum for the era, all while he continued to draw benefit payments meant for people who had nothing. That contradiction between his claimed poverty and his real wealth eventually became part of what caught up with him. In the summer of 1984, a police operation known as Operation Eagle placed Comerford and his associates under close surveillance. The breakthrough came after one of his senior dealers was arrested following a police chase that started in the city centre and ended in the Anfield area of Liverpool. Facing serious charges, that dealer began cooperating with investigators. He led police directly to Comerford's council flat, the same modest address tied to his benefit claims, revealing that it was actually being used as the operational headquarters of his drug business. Through this cooperation, it emerged that Comerford's network had been supplying large quantities of drugs to United States military personnel stationed in West Germany, extending his operation well beyond British borders. The case against him solidified when Comerford and an associate were arrested at Heathrow Airport, arriving on a flight from Stuttgart, Germany, in possession of 0.5 kilogram of heroin. The following year, in 1985, he stood trial at the Old Bailey in London, one of the most well-known criminal courts in the country, and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. It remains one of the longest sentences of his career and reflected how seriously the courts by that point viewed his role in organised drug trafficking. Comerford did eventually return to the streets again, and by the mid-1990s, he was back under investigation. HM Customs and Excise, the government agency responsible at the time for enforcing import and export laws, had received intelligence suggesting he was involved in a new drug conspiracy. In November 1995, that investigation led to his arrest during a sting operation carried out at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Birmingham. The case centered on a shipment of 10 kilograms of cocaine that had come from Ecuador, with an estimated street value of £1 million. The drugs themselves had already been intercepted and seized at the port of Felixstowe. A year later, in November 1996, Comerford was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. Even in his 70s, Comerford could not fully step away from the life that had defined him. In March 2003, police stopped and searched a car he was traveling in with a group of friends. Inside, they found a quantity of heroin valued at roughly £10,000. Comerford was charged with possession with intent to supply. His solicitor at the time, Robert Brody, argued that his client had no knowledge the drugs were in the vehicle. The case never reached a resolution in court. Later that year, in August, Comerford was diagnosed with liver cancer. His health declined quickly after the diagnosis, and by October 2003, he had died at the age of 70. He was given a small, quiet funeral, attended by only a handful of close friends and family members, a modest send-off for a man who had spent decades being described in the press as one of the city's most significant criminals. The story did not end with his death. About a month afterward, police were granted permission to keep £25,000 that had been seized from his home following his March 2003 arrest. Comerford's family initially contested this, asking for the money to be returned to them. Under the Proceeds of Crime Act, a law designed to let authorities seize assets connected to criminal activity, police pursued the matter through Liverpool Magistrates' Court, working alongside a dedicated money laundering investigation team. Eventually, the court granted a forfeiture order, allowing police to keep the funds permanently, and Comerford's family withdrew their claim rather than continue fighting it. Looking back at his career, Comerford is widely regarded as one of Liverpool's first true crime bosses, a man whose activities helped set the stage for the drug kingpins who followed him in later decades, including figures like John Harser and Curtis Warren. His own solicitor, Rex Makin, who represented him at various points across his long criminal history, once described him in terms that captured how differently people saw him depending on which side of the law they stood on. Makin called him one of the most charming criminals he had ever encountered and said that Comerford's career as a criminal on Merseyside had been more colourful than any other in the previous 50 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the time Tommy Comerford was lowered into the ground in 2003, the city he had once dominated already belonged to a different generation of criminals, men who had watched how he built his network through the docks and used those same lessons to build operations of their own. One of them had grown up not far from where Comerford ran his early rackets, and by the 1990s, he was moving drugs on a scale that made the Liverpool Mafia look almost small by comparison. Case 2. Curtis Warren, Interpol's Target 1. Curtis Francis Warren was born on the 31st of May, 1963, and grew up in the Toxteth area of Liverpool. His father, also named Curtis, was originally from South America and worked as a seaman with the Norwegian Merchant Navy. His mother, Antonia Chantra, was the daughter of a man who worked as a boiler attendant in a shipyard. Warren grew up alongside an older brother named Ramon and a sister named Maria. Like Tommy Comerford before him, Warren's path into serious crime started with armed robbery, a conviction that eventually earned him a 5-year prison sentence early in his criminal record. After his release, local police at the time noted that Warren appeared to be turning his life around. He took a job as a bouncer at a nightclub in Liverpool, work that seemed, on the surface, like a step toward an honest living. In reality, that job became his education in the drug trade. As a bouncer, Warren controlled who could enter and leave the venue. That gave him direct access to the dealers who worked the club, and he used that access to build relationships with them, absorbing knowledge about how the drug business actually operated from the inside. By the late 1980s, Warren had formed a partnership with a car dealer from Middlesbrough named Brian Charrington. In September 1991, the two men sailed together to France aboard Charrington's personal yacht, travelling on British visitor passports, which were a legal form of short-term travel document at the time. From France, they continued on to Venezuela using standard 10-year British passports. There, they struck a deal with the Cali Cartel, one of the most powerful cocaine trafficking organizations in the world at the time, based in Colombia. The plan involved smuggling cocaine inside steel boxes that were then hidden within lead ingots, a method designed to defeat standard customs inspections. When the shipment arrived in the United Kingdom, officers from HM Customs and Excise cut open one of the ingots as a check. They found nothing unusual and let the shipment pass through. It was only later, after being tipped off by Dutch police, that British Customs learned the drugs had in fact been concealed inside the steel boxes rather than the ingots themselves, and by that point, Charrington, Warren, and the shipment could not be traced. This should have been the end of the operation, but a second shipment using the identical method was already on its way from South America, carrying roughly 907 kilograms of cocaine. When that second shipment landed in the UK in early 1992, Charrington, Warren, and 26 other people connected to the operation were arrested as part of a prosecution brought by HM Customs and Excise. During preliminary court proceedings, an extraordinary detail came out. Charrington was revealed to be a police informant working for the Northeast Regional Crime Squad. Customs officials decided to continue their prosecution anyway, despite objections from Charrington's own police handlers, named in court as Harry Knaggs and Ian Whedon. During the trial at Newcastle Crown Court, it was alleged that Warren's knowledge of the operation ran so deep that he knew the exact length of the largest drill bit owned by HM Customs, information he had apparently used to calculate the precise size and depth the lead ingots needed to be to avoid detection. Eventually, through the involvement of Conservative Member of Parliament Tim Devlin, a meeting took place that resulted in customs officials being instructed to drop the charges against Charrington on the 28th of January 1993. Once that happened, the case against everyone involved, including Warren, collapsed, and all of the accused were acquitted. According to accounts published after the fact, Warren is said to have walked past customs officers on his way out of the courthouse and told them, in effect, that he was going to go spend the £87 million he had made from the first shipment, and that they could not touch him. Several months later, customs officials reportedly spotted Knaggs, one of Charrington's police handlers, driving a car worth £70,000 that had previously been registered to Charrington. Warren returned home to Liverpool after his acquittal, but conditions in the city had shifted while he had been away. A string of killings connected to organised crime figures had taken place, and police continued to keep close watch on him following the collapse of the high-profile Newcastle case. Facing pressure on both fronts, from rival criminals and from ongoing police attention, Warren made the decision to leave the country. In 1995, he relocated to a villa in the town of Sassenheim in the Netherlands. By this point, his wealth had grown to a scale that gave him interests spread across several countries. He owned casinos in Spain, discos in Turkey, a vineyard in Bulgaria, and land in the Gambia, along with money held in Swiss bank accounts. He had accumulated enough by this stage that he could have walked away from the drug trade entirely and lived comfortably for the rest of his life. Instead, he chose to keep going. Dutch police monitored Warren's phone calls to his contacts back in the UK during this period, and what they observed revealed just how careful he had become. Warren had a photographic memory, and he used it as a security measure. He never referred to his contacts by their real names, relying instead on code words. Every detail connected to his Swiss bank accounts existed only in his memory, never written down anywhere, and he kept no physical records at all for his drug operations. This level of discretion gave him what amounted to an unlimited line of credit with cartels in South America, along with cannabis suppliers in Turkey and across Eastern Europe, since none of his partners needed to worry about paper trails leading back to them. The operation came to an end on the 24th of October 1996, when a specialist Dutch police unit raided Warren's villa, along with other properties he owned in the country. Warren and several of his associates were arrested on the spot. Inside the properties, police found 3 firearms along with ammunition, hand grenades, crates containing 960 canisters of CS gas, 400 kilograms of cocaine, 1,500 kilograms of cannabis resin, 60 kilograms of heroin, 50 kilograms of ecstasy, and a mix of Dutch guilders and US dollars in cash. Altogether, the haul was valued at roughly £125 million, one of the largest drug seizures connected to a single operation at that time. In 1998, before his conviction caught up with him, Warren made his only appearance on the Sunday Times Rich List, an annual ranking of Britain's wealthiest people. He was listed there as a property developer, with an estimated fortune of £40 million. His conviction in the subsequent trial led to his removal from that list entirely. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the mechanics of Warren's plan in detail. South American cocaine was to be shipped to his vineyard in Bulgaria, where it would be suspended inside wine bottles for onward shipment to the Netherlands and then to Liverpool. In total, the police had recovered illegal goods, drugs, and wine valued at £125 million. Warren was sentenced to 12 years in prison and sent to the maximum security New Vossenveld prison in the Dutch town of Vught. A follow-up forensic accounting investigation into his finances managed to locate only £20 million of an estimated fortune thought to be worth around £120 million, and even that £20 million could not legally be seized by Dutch police, British police, or Interpol. Warren's time in prison brought a second, unrelated conviction that added years to his sentence. On the afternoon of the 15th of September 1999, he got into a fight in the prison yard with a Turkish national named Cemal Guklu, who was serving a 20-year sentence for murder and attempted murder. According to the account given at trial, Guklu shouted abuse at Warren and moved toward him to throw a punch. Warren dodged the punch, and a short struggle followed, during which Guklu ended up on the ground. Warren then kicked him in the head 4 times. Guklu got back up and came at Warren again, only to be punched back down, where he struck his head, lost consciousness, and never woke up again. He died in hospital a short time later. At his 2001 trial, Warren argued that he had acted in self-defense. The Dutch judge disagreed with the extent of the response, finding Warren guilty of manslaughter and commenting that he had used far more force than the situation called for. He was sentenced to an additional 4 years, pushing his expected release date out to 2014. In 2002, while still investigating the Bulgarian wine shipment scheme, Dutch police obtained an asset seizure order targeting Warren's remaining wealth. Despite the scale of his fortune, they were only able to physically locate £180,000. Prosecutors instead used the proceeds of crime law to legally compel him to repay 26 million guilders, equivalent to roughly $14 million, or face another 5 years added to his sentence, which would have pushed his release date all the way to 2019. After negotiations, Warren agreed to pay 15 million guilders, about $8 million, avoiding the extra 5 years. Even from behind bars, Warren remained a target for investigators. In February 2005, Dutch authorities charged him with running an international drug smuggling operation from inside his prison cell. For his own safety during the resulting trial, he was moved between roughly 6 different jails. He was initially found guilty, but successfully appealed the conviction and was released from Dutch custody in June 2007. Freedom did not mean Warren could move freely. The British, Irish, and Portuguese governments all refused to issue him a passport. Britain's Serious Organised Crime Agency, known as SOCA, placed him under a program described as Lifetime Offender Management, tracking his movements under the codename Operation Floss. That November, Warren's former right-hand man, Colin Smith, was shot dead as he left a gym called Nell's in the Speke area of Liverpool, a killing that underscored just how dangerous the world Warren operated in remained, even for those closest to him. Just 3 weeks after walking free from the Dutch prison, on Saturday the 30th of June 2007, SOCA contacted Jersey police to alert them that Warren had landed at Manchester Airport and paid cash for a plane ticket. Officers then observed him in Jersey in the company of a known Liverpool associate, Taffin Carter, who was by then living on the island. The 2 men drove around in Carter's Volkswagen Golf, visiting several locations including the isolated St. Catherine's breakwater. Drugs sold on Jersey at roughly 3 times the price they commanded in mainland Britain or France, which made the island an attractive market. After Warren returned to the UK, Jersey police launched Operation Koala, a surveillance effort that involved bugging several locations, including public phone boxes and the home of Taffin Carter's girlfriend, Suzanne Skur. Through this surveillance, investigators discovered that a friend of Warren's named John Welsh planned to travel to Amsterdam to meet a known Warren associate, a Moroccan national named Mohamed Liazid. Jersey police wanted to place a bugging device inside Welsh's hire car while it was in Saint-Malo, France, but French and Belgian authorities refused permission, citing concerns that doing so would breach the European Convention on Human Rights. Jersey police, which was not formally signed into that convention but was still legally bound by it, went ahead and bugged the car regardless. A judge who later reviewed the case, Sir Richard Tucker, described the action as reprehensible and unlawful. Despite the legal problems surrounding how the evidence was gathered, the surveillance operation expanded further. SOCA kept watch on Warren in Liverpool, while Dutch police monitored Liazid, who was working as a police informant, in Amsterdam. Investigators cross-referenced information gathered from various phone boxes to work out who was calling whom. At trial, it emerged that Warren had been using 3 UK mobile phones and 1 Jersey mobile phone, and had made 1,587 telephone calls in just 3 weeks. placing them from phone boxes scattered across the northwest of England and North Wales, including the Wirral, Liverpool, Manchester, Llangollen, and Chester, all connecting back to Liazid. In 2007, Warren was arrested in St Helens as part of a joint investigation involving Jersey police, Merseyside police, SOCA, and law enforcement agencies from Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. He pleaded not guilty, and the case became bogged down for 2 years in legal arguments over whether the evidence gathered from the illegally bugged car could even be used. Eventually, it was agreed that there was enough evidence from other sources to proceed with the case regardless. At one point, Jersey police offered Warren a deal: plead guilty and receive an 8-year sentence with no confiscation of his assets. Warren turned the offer down. The Metropolitan Police in London ended up lending Jersey police an armoured prisoner transport van so that Warren and his co-defendants could be moved safely to court each day of the trial. During proceedings, it emerged that no drugs had actually been successfully imported in this particular plot, since Warren's contacts in Jersey had failed to come up with the necessary money. A local politician, Senator Ben Shenton, raised concerns about the cost to Jersey taxpayers of funding Warren's legal defence, while a group called Progress Jersey questioned whether it was appropriate for the entire resources of the island's drug squad to be focused on a single target. On the 7th of October, Warren was found guilty of conspiracy to smuggle cannabis. On the 3rd of December 2009, he was sentenced to 13 years in prison for his role in the plot. Jersey police also opened an investigation into his overall wealth, aiming to strip him of whatever profits remained from his decades in the drug trade. Warren began serving his sentence at HMP Full Sutton near York, before later being transferred to HMP Belmarsh. He made 2 unsuccessful attempts to appeal his conviction directly to the Lieutenant Governor of Jersey, General Sir John McColl, once in March 2011 and again in September of the same year. In November 2013, a court ordered Warren to pay a confiscation order worth £198 million, or face an additional 10 years in prison. He appealed the order, but lost that appeal in March 2014, meaning the debt and the threat of extra prison time remained hanging over him. In 2020, a prison officer named Stephanie Smithwhite was jailed for 2 years after it emerged she had engaged in an intimate relationship with Warren while he was in custody, a case that drew national attention to the security failures it exposed inside the prison system. Warren was eventually released from prison in November 2022. He did not stay entirely clear of the law once free. On the 27th of August 2024, he pleaded guilty at Liverpool Crown Court to 6 separate breaches of a serious crime prevention order that had been placed on him as a condition of his release. He was sentenced to 14 months in prison, suspended for 18 months, meaning he avoided an immediate return to custody as long as he stayed within the terms of the order going forward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Warren's story stretched across 3 decades and 4 different countries, built on a level of secrecy and memory that investigators struggled to penetrate for years at a time. But while he was building that empire from a rented villa in the Netherlands, the city he had left behind was already descending into a wave of gangland shootings that had nothing to do with him directly, killings tied to a separate feud that would leave one Liverpool family shattered on a quiet street in Toxteth. Case 3. David Unge, the killing that changed Liverpool. On the afternoon of Monday, the 1st of May, 1995, a man named David Unge was driving his Volkswagen Passat through North Hill Street in the Dingle area of Liverpool. At around 20 minutes to 6 in the evening, he was ambushed. Gunmen opened fire on his car, and Unge was killed at the scene. His death would go on to be remembered as one of the defining moments in Liverpool's gun crime history, a single shooting that exposed how far armed violence had spread through the city's underworld by the mid-1990s. To understand why Unge's death hit the city so hard, it helps to understand the area he came from and the family name he carried. Dingle and the wider Toxteth district sit close to the Liverpool docks, an area that had once thrived on shipping work but had suffered years of economic decline by the 1990s as the docks employed far fewer people than they once had. The same neighbourhoods that had powered Liverpool's economy for generations had, by this point, become associated instead with unemployment, poverty, and a growing drug trade that filled the gap left behind by the disappearing dockwork. The Unge family was well known in this part of the city, and David Unge himself was a recognised figure within it, someone whose name carried weight in the local underworld, even before the events of 1995 pushed him into national headlines. The killing did not come out of nowhere. In the weeks leading up to his death, a clear pattern of escalating conflict had already been building around him. 6 weeks before he was shot dead, Ungi won a fight on Biles Street against a man named John Phillips, an associate of the Liverpool drug trafficker Curtis Warren. The fight was what is known locally as a straightener, a one-on-one contest arranged specifically to settle a dispute between two people without involving weapons or wider violence. On that same day, Ungi was shot at in nearby Morton Street, Toxteth, though he survived that attack. Phillips was later arrested in connection with the attempted murder charge relating to that shooting, but the case against him was ultimately dropped before it reached a conviction. The tension between Ungi and Phillips centered, at least in part, on a wine bar called Cheers, located on Aigburth Road, which Ungi and his associates regularly used. According to an account later given by a prosecutor in court, the underlying dispute involved Phillips and his associates on one side and the Ungi family on the other, with the root of the disagreement tracing back to who controlled the bar itself. Phillips's mother-in-law reportedly wanted to take over the business from its owner at the time, a situation that put her, and by extension Phillips, into direct conflict with the Ungi family's presence there. A week before Ungi was killed, he was barred from entering Cheers altogether, a clear sign that the feud had already reached a boiling point well before the shooting on North Hill Street. 2 days after Ungi's death, the Cheers wine bar itself was set on fire in an arson attack. Detectives investigating the murder linked that fire directly to the killing, treating it as part of the same underlying conflict rather than a separate, unrelated crime. The bar that had been at the center of the dispute between the two families was gone within 48 hours of Ungi's murder, a visible and immediate consequence of the violence that had consumed the feud. News of the shooting spread quickly through Liverpool, and the response from the police was immediate and highly visible. By Friday, the 5th of May, just 4 days after the killing, armed police officers had begun openly patrolling the streets of Toxteth and Dingle, a level of visible armed presence that was unusual for the city at the time. Merseyside's chief constable at the time, James Sharples, made clear that his force intended to respond to the wave of armed violence with matching force of its own, signalling that the police were prepared to confront armed criminals directly rather than simply investigate after the fact. The scale of the problem extended well beyond Ungi's individual case. Liverpool experienced 10 separate shootings within a period of just 22 days during this stretch of 1995, a frequency of gun violence that alarmed both the public and the authorities. The situation became serious enough that Sharples convened what was described at the time as a Council of War, a meeting bringing together senior figures to address the crisis directly, treating the wave of shootings as something closer to an active conflict than a series of isolated criminal incidents. As the investigation into Ungi's murder continued, police carried out a reconstruction of the killing, staging the events of the shooting in an effort to jog witnesses' memories and gather new information. Around 500 people turned out to watch the reconstruction take place, a turnout that reflected just how much public attention the case had drawn in the weeks following the murder. Later that same month, on the 23rd of May, it was announced that all police officers on duty in the Dingle, Toxteth and Liverpool city centre areas would be issued with bulletproof vests, a direct response to the danger officers faced while working in neighbourhoods where armed violence had become a regular occurrence. Tensions in the area did not fade quickly. On Thursday, the 1st of June, police appealed publicly for calm as an uneasy peace attempted to settle back over the streets of Dingle. That fragile calm did not hold for long. A gang set 3 cars on fire during a fresh outbreak of tension, and the situation grew serious enough that around 600 people gathered after police officers visited the Ungi family home on Malta Walk in Dingle the previous afternoon. Officers had to hold the crowd back as tensions flared in the immediate aftermath of that visit, illustrating just how closely the local community was watching every move connected to the case, and how quickly a single incident could draw a large, agitated crowd onto the streets. Despite the intensity of the police response and the scale of public attention the case received, the investigation into who was directly responsible for shooting David Ungi never resulted in a conviction. Years after the murder, Merseyside police continued to describe the case as an open investigation, stating that they had not given up on identifying and prosecuting those responsible. One name that surfaced in connection with the case was Barry O'Rourke, known by the nickname Bungie, who was identified publicly as a suspect. At the time reporters revisited the case for its 10th anniversary in 2005, O'Rourke was reported to be facing separate drug charges abroad, but no conviction connected to Ungi's murder itself was ever secured against him or anyone else. The man whose rivalry with Ungi had set off the chain of events leading to the murder did not escape violence himself. A year after Phillips had been arrested and then released without charge over the earlier Morton Street shooting, he was shot 4 times in a separate attack. He survived that shooting, but his story did not end there. Phillips later died as a result of a drug overdose, closing out a life that had been deeply entangled with the same underworld conflicts that claimed Ungi's life. The murder of David Ungi mattered beyond the specific facts of the case because of what it revealed about the state of organised crime in Liverpool during this period. The city's underworld in the mid-1990s was not operating in an orderly, hierarchical way with clear rules of engagement between rival groups. Instead, disputes that started over comparatively small matters, control of a single wine bar, a personal grudge settled through an arranged fistfight, could escalate within weeks into public assassinations carried out on ordinary residential streets in broad daylight. The killing took place at 20 minutes to 6 in the evening, a time when North Hill Street would have had people going about their normal routines, walking home from work or running errands. The willingness of the gunman to carry out the attack under those conditions, rather than waiting for a more discreet opportunity, signaled a level of confidence and disregard for public safety that alarmed police and residents alike. This period in Liverpool's history connects directly to broader patterns that had already reshaped the city's underworld over the previous decade and a half. The drug trade that filled the economic vacuum left behind by the shrinking docks had, by the 1980s, grown large enough that the press had taken to referring to Liverpool as a hub for heroin distribution. Organised crime groups that had once relied on armed robbery, following the same pattern seen in Tommy Comerford's earlier career, increasingly shifted their focus toward narcotics, since drug trafficking offered more consistent profits without the same level of immediate physical danger that came with robbing banks or security vans. As more money flowed through the drug trade, the stakes attached to controlling territory, supply routes, and business fronts like the Cheers wine bar grew correspondingly higher, and the willingness of rival factions to resolve disputes through violence grew right alongside it. Curtis Warren, whose own rise through Liverpool's underworld during this same era eventually made him one of the most significant drug traffickers in European history, had already left Liverpool for the Netherlands by 1995, partly because of the exact kind of violence that claimed David Ungi's life. Warren's decision to relocate abroad came after a string of killings connected to organised crime figures in the city, killings that made it too dangerous, both from rival criminals and from ongoing police pressure, for him to continue operating out of Liverpool directly. Ungi's murder was one of the most prominent examples of the violence that Warren and others were reacting to when they chose to move their operations elsewhere, even as the underlying drug trade that fueled these conflicts continued to expand. The involvement of a figure connected to Curtis Warren's circle, John Phillips, in the dispute that led to Ungi's death illustrates just how tightly interconnected Liverpool's criminal underworld was during this period. Different feuds, different family disputes, and different business rivalries did not exist in separate, isolated bubbles. They overlapped, with individuals moving between different conflicts and different alliances, depending on where their personal and financial interests lay at any given moment. A dispute that began over ownership of a single wine bar on Aigburth Road ended up connected, through Phillips, to the wider network of relationships surrounding one of the most significant drug operations Britain had ever seen. For the Ungi family itself, the events of 1995 marked a turning point that extended the family's association with Liverpool's criminal underworld for years afterward. Anto Walk, the street where police visited the family home in the days following the murder, became a site closely watched by both the community and law enforcement in the immediate aftermath of the killing. The crowd of 600 people that gathered there on the 31st of May reflected how directly connected the local community felt to the unfolding events, whether out of concern for the family, curiosity about the investigation, or simmering tension tied to the broader feud that had claimed Ungi's life. Despite everything that followed, the fundamental question at the centre of the case, who exactly pulled the trigger on North Hill Street that Monday evening, was never definitively answered in a court of law. The scale of the police response, the armed patrols, the bulletproof vests, the reconstruction watched by hundreds, and the Council of War chaired by the city's most senior police officer, all stood in contrast to the outcome of the actual criminal investigation, which never produced a conviction. Merseyside Police's continued description of the case as an open investigation, even years after the shooting, speaks to how difficult it remained to build a prosecutable case in an environment where witnesses had every reason to stay silent and where the underlying feud involved people already deeply embedded in violent criminal networks. David Ungi's death did not end the pattern of violence connected to the disputes swirling around him in 1995. His rival Phillips survived one attempt on his life only to die from a drug overdose later on, a death that, while not itself a shooting, closed out a chapter of the same feud that had consumed both men. The wine bar at the center of the original dispute burned down within days of the murder that many believed it had helped cause. And the broader wave of shootings that swept through Liverpool that spring, 10 in 22 days, showed that Ungi's killing was not an isolated event, but rather one especially prominent flashpoint within a citywide surge in armed violence that had already been building before his death and that continued to concern police well after it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The chaos playing out on the streets of Toxteth and Dingle throughout 1995 created exactly the kind of environment in which a very different sort of criminal figure could thrive, someone willing to insert himself directly into the drug trade's day-to-day disputes. Not as a trafficker moving product, but as an enforcer collecting money from dealers who could not afford to say no. In the years surrounding Ungi's murder, one man from Toxteth built a fearsome reputation doing exactly that, extracting payments from people already embedded in the same underworld that had just buried one of its own on a quiet residential street. Case 4. Stephen French, Toxteth's Devil. Stephen French built one of the most talked-about reputations in Liverpool's criminal history, earning the nickname The Devil for his conduct in the city's underworld through the 1980s and 1990s. Unlike Tommy Comerford, Curtis Warren, or the feud that killed David Ungi, French's story is documented far less by court paperwork and far more by television appearances, newspaper profiles, and his own retelling of his life in interviews given after he stepped away from crime. That difference matters, and it needs to be said plainly before going any further. Much of what circulates about French's criminal career comes from second-hand accounts and his own version of events, rather than from verified police records or trial transcripts. Where the story can be confirmed through court records, it will be treated as fact. Where it rests only on reputation, documentary appearances, or French's own retelling, that distinction will be made clear. French grew up in the Toxteth area of Liverpool, the same district that produced David Ungi's rivalry with John Phillips and that sat at the center of so much of the city's underworld activity during this period. By the time documentary makers and journalists began profiling him in the 2000s, French had already built a reputation as one of Liverpool's most feared underworld figures from decades earlier, someone whose name alone was enough to carry weight on the streets. The nickname The Devil followed him through nearly every piece of media coverage and every documentary appearance connected to his story, a label that stuck because of how thoroughly it was said to capture his conduct during his years as an active criminal. The general shape of the story told about French, repeated across multiple television programs and newspaper profiles, describes him operating as an enforcer within Liverpool's drug trade, rather than as a trafficker moving product himself. According to this account, French positioned himself as a kind of unofficial tax collector, targeting drug dealers who had made money and extracting payment from them through violence and intimidation. This kind of role existed within the wider ecosystem of organized crime in cities like Liverpool during the period when the drug trade was expanding rapidly and dealers who suddenly found themselves handling large amounts of cash became natural targets for anyone willing to use force to take a cut. French became known, in the retelling of his story, as one of the people willing to play that role, and to play it aggressively enough that his reputation for violence became a central part of how the wider underworld understood him. Documentary television played a significant part in cementing French's reputation with a wider audience beyond Liverpool itself. In October 2008, he appeared as the subject of the first episode of a series called Danny Dyer's Deadliest Men, a British television programme in which the actor and presenter Danny Dyer met and spoke with men considered among the country's most feared criminal figures. The episode description at the time introduced French as a one-time Liverpool gangster nicknamed The Devil, who had gone on to become one of the country's leading underworld operators before ultimately turning away from life as a drug baron. He appeared again in 2015 in an episode of a similar series, British Gangsters, Faces of the Underworld, which paired a profile of French with another criminal figure as part of an episode focused on Liverpool. What can be established with more confidence, because it comes from an actual criminal conviction rather than from documentary retellings, took place in 2013. That year, French was sentenced to 3 years in prison after being convicted in connection with an incident in which he pistol-whipped a man, striking him with a handgun, and then disposed of the weapon by throwing it into the River Mersey. This conviction represents the clearest, most concrete piece of French's criminal record, available through independent reporting, confirmed across multiple separate news sources covering his case. It placed him back behind bars decades after the period when his reputation as an enforcer had first been built, showing that whatever transformation French had undergone by that point in his life, it had not fully removed him from violent confrontation. French's story did not end with his release from that sentence. In 2016, further legal trouble followed. He appeared at Liverpool Magistrates Court and later at Liverpool Crown Court, facing serious charges that included counts of rape, assault against the same woman on separate occasions, and a separate charge of threatening to kill a man. French appeared at one hearing by video link from HMP Preston, where he was being held in custody at the time. He pleaded not guilty to all of the charges against him. His defense lawyer Gareth Thomas told the court at the time that French's defense would center on the argument that the allegations against him were malicious and without foundation. A trial date was set for October of 2016. Publicly available reporting on the case does not include a confirmed record of the trial's eventual outcome, and no verdict could be independently confirmed through the sources reviewed for this account. Given the seriousness of the charges and the absence of a confirmed resolution, this part of French's story should be understood strictly as an unresolved legal matter, rather than as an established fact about guilt or innocence in either direction. The broader narrative that has followed French through most of his media appearances describes a personal transformation, a shift away from the violence that defined his early reputation and toward a new identity built around anti-violence advocacy and religious faith. In interviews and documentary appearances following his years as an active criminal figure, French has presented himself as someone who moved past his old life, taking on a public role speaking out against gun violence and gang culture in Liverpool, particularly among younger people at risk of being drawn into the same world he once inhabited. This reform narrative forms a significant part of how French has been portrayed in later media coverage, positioning him as someone with first-hand knowledge of the underworld who has chosen to use that knowledge to try to steer others away from the same path. The 2013 conviction for pistol-whipping a man and disposing of the weapon in the river complicates that reform narrative considerably. A conviction of that nature, occurring well after French had already begun presenting himself publicly as a reformed figure, demonstrates that the line between his past and his claimed transformation was not as clean as the reform narrative alone might suggest. Whatever public role French had built for himself by that point as a former criminal turned anti-violence voice, the events behind that 2013 sentence showed he remained capable of the same kind of violent confrontation that had defined his reputation decades earlier. French's story illustrates a pattern that shows up repeatedly in coverage of former organized crime figures who transition into public life after their criminal careers wind down. A reputation built during decades of alleged violence and underworld activity becomes difficult to separate cleanly from later claims of reform, particularly when court records complicate the narrative rather than closing the book on it entirely. Unlike Tommy Comerford, whose criminal record is documented through a clear sequence of convictions stretching from a 1969 bank robbery through drug trafficking cases in the 1980s and 1990s, or Curtis Warren, whose international drug operation was tracked in detail by police forces across multiple countries, French's documented legal history is thinner and less continuous, built around isolated court appearances, separated by long stretches covered mainly by television profiles and personal interviews, rather than ongoing police investigation records. This does not mean French's underworld reputation was invented or exaggerated beyond recognition. Multiple independent television productions, produced by different broadcasters at different points across nearly a decade, chose to profile him specifically because of a reputation that was already well established within Liverpool by the time cameras started rolling. Producers and journalists working on programs like Danny Dyer's Deadliest Men and British Gangsters, Faces of the Underworld, would have had their own reasons for vetting the credibility of a subject like French before featuring him prominently, and the consistency of his portrayal as one of Liverpool's most notorious criminal figures across separate productions lends some weight to the broader reputation, even without a corresponding paper trail of criminal convictions to match the scale of the reputation itself. What remains firmly established, independent of any documentary framing or personal retelling, is the criminal conviction from 2013. A man was struck with a handgun. The weapon used in that assault was thrown into the River Mersey afterward, apparently in an effort to dispose of evidence. French was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison as a direct result. That single, verifiable event anchors French's story in the actual criminal justice system, standing apart from the layers of documentary narration, personal interviews, and media-built reputation that surround the rest of his history. The charges that followed in 2016, while serious, remain legally unresolved based on available reporting, and should be treated with appropriate caution rather than presented as settled fact in either direction. French pleaded not guilty and stated through his legal team that he intended to fight the allegations as malicious. Whatever happened at the trial that was scheduled for October of that year is not something that can be confirmed through the sources available for this account, and it would be inaccurate and unfair to suggest otherwise. French's overall story sits at an unusual point within Liverpool's broader criminal history. He does not fit neatly alongside figures like Comerford or Warren, whose criminal enterprises left behind extensive paper trails through customs investigations, international policing operations, and lengthy court proceedings that documented the mechanics of their operations in significant detail. Instead, French's reputation rests heavily on the retelling of his story, both by himself in later interviews and by television producers who built entire documentary episodes around presenting him as one of the era's most feared figures. The one piece of hard legal evidence available, the 2013 conviction, confirms that French remained capable of serious violence, well into a period when his public image had already shifted toward reform, a contradiction that runs through the entirety of his later public life. Toxteth, the neighborhood that shaped French, sat at the center of much of the underworld activity already covered across Liverpool's criminal history during this era. It was the same district where David Unge's rivalry with John Phillips played out, the same district where Curtis Warren grew up before rising to become one of Europe's most significant drug traffickers, and the same district where economic decline, tied to the shrinking Liverpool docks, had already pushed a generation of young men toward crime as one of the few paths that seemed to offer a way out of poverty. French's story, whatever the exact details of his individual conduct, took shape against that same backdrop, in the same streets that had already produced some of the most significant criminal careers connected to the city. A note on the limits of this account matters here more than almost anywhere else in this series. French's story, more than any other covered so far, rests on a mixture of documented court outcomes and a much larger body of reputation-based material that cannot be independently verified through official records. The 2013 conviction stands as confirmed fact. The broader narrative of French as a violent tax collector operating throughout the 1980s and 1990s, extracting payment from drug dealers through intimidation, comes primarily from documentary programs and journalistic profiles built around interviews with French himself and people who knew him, rather than from criminal convictions specifically tied to that activity. The 2016 charges remain an open question given the absence of a confirmed trial outcome in available reporting. Readers and viewers encountering French's story should understand that the scale of his reputation and the scale of his confirmed legal record are not the same thing, and that gap is itself part of what makes his story different from the other cases covered in this series so far. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every notorious figure connected to Liverpool's underworld left behind a reputation built primarily through court records and criminal convictions. Some built theirs through documentaries, newspaper profiles, and their own retelling of events that police files could never fully confirm or deny. The next case moves back toward a story anchored much more firmly in police investigation and courtroom evidence, tracing how a violent teenage gang turf war on the streets of Croxteth ended with the death of an 11-year-old boy who had nothing to do with the feud that killed him. Case 5, Sean Mercer and the killing of Rhys Jones. On the evening of the 22nd of August, 2007, an 11-year-old boy named Rhys Milford Jones was walking home alone from football practice in Croxteth a neighbourhood in the north of Liverpool. He would have turned 12 just 5 weeks later. Rees had recently finished his time at Broad Square Primary School on the Norris Green housing estate and was due to start secondary school at Fazakerley High School the following month. People who knew him, including his former head teacher and his neighbours, described him as a friendly and popular boy who loved football. He played for a local club called the Fir Tree Boys. That evening, Rees was crossing the car park of the Fir Tree pub on the Croxteth Park estate on his way home. As he crossed the car park, a hooded youth riding a silver mountain bike approached him. The youth held out a Smith & Wesson handgun at arm's length and fired 3 shots. The bullets loaded in the gun were later found to be the wrong type for that particular weapon. It was initially believed that one of the shots had struck Rees in the neck. During the trial that followed, a pathologist gave a more precise account, explaining that the bullet had entered his back above his left shoulder blade and exited through the front right side of his neck. Rees's mother, Melanie Jones, rushed to the scene as soon as she heard that her son had been shot. By the time she reached him, he was already unconscious. Paramedics worked for 90 minutes trying to resuscitate him. He was pronounced dead a short time after arriving at Alder Hey Children's Hospital, a hospital in Liverpool that specialises in treating children. The shooting happened in an ordinary place, at an ordinary time of day, to a boy who had no connection to the conflict that led to his death. That detail is central to why the case became one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Britain during that period. A local radio station, Radio City 96.7, dedicated its late-night programming that same evening, the slot running from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., to an amnesty appeal for witnesses and a wider discussion about gun crime in the city. The station went on to launch an anti-gun crime campaign called In Rees's Name, Get Guns Off Our Streets, an initiative that had the backing of the Jones family. In the days immediately following the shooting, police arrested 4 people between the ages of 15 and 19, though all 4 were later released. 2 further teenagers were arrested and released on bail while investigations continued. Police described the murder weapon publicly as a black handgun with a long barrel and appealed to the public for information. More than 300 officers and gun crime specialists were deployed to work on finding whoever was responsible. On the 19th of September, 4 weeks after the murder, Rees's parents made a fresh public appeal for witnesses to come forward. A week later, on the 26th of September, the murder was reconstructed on the BBC programme Crime Watch, a national television show that works with police forces to solicit tips from the public about unsolved crimes. During that episode, Melanie Jones appealed directly to the mother of the person responsible, asking her to persuade her son to turn himself in. The appeal worked in one specific sense. It prompted 12 separate calls into the programme, and every single caller gave police the same name. Despite this, and despite reports that the identity of the person responsible had already become widely known on the streets, appearing on internet forums and even in graffiti around the area, police continued appealing publicly for witnesses. Knowing a name was not the same as having evidence strong enough to bring charges, and officers needed people willing to speak on record about what they had seen or heard. It took until the following spring for the investigation to produce formal arrests. On the 15th of April 2008, Merseyside police confirmed that 11 people, all between the ages of 17 and 25, had been arrested in connection with the murder. The following day, 6 more suspects of a similar age were arrested, 1 in connection with the murder itself, and the other 5 for assisting an offender, meaning they were suspected of helping the person responsible avoid capture after the fact. 1 of these 6 had already been charged separately with possessing a firearm. All 6 were remanded in custody by Liverpool magistrates on the 17th of April 2008. A further man was charged in connection with the case the following day and was remanded on the same day he was charged. The trial that followed lasted 9 weeks at Liverpool Crown Court. On the 16th of December 2008, Sean Mercer, a member of a gang known as the Croxteth Crew, was found guilty of murder. Mercer had been 16 years old at the time of the shooting and was 18 by the time of his conviction. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, meaning he would not become eligible for release until at least 2030, when he would be around 40 years old. Mercer was not tried alone. Several other members connected to the same gang were convicted of assisting an offender, a charge that applies to people who help someone evade justice after a crime has been committed. Those convicted on this charge included James Yates, Nathan Quinn, a boy referred to in court only as Boy M because he was still under 18 and could not be legally named, Gary Kays, and Melvin Coy. Another underage defendant, referred to during the trial as Boy K, was later publicly identified as Dean Kelly once he turned 18, and he was convicted of 4 separate offences connected to the case. Kays and Coy were each sentenced to 7 years in prison. Sentencing for 4 of the defendants was delayed until the following month. In January of 2009, James Yates received a 7-year sentence, Dean Kelly received 4 years, and Nathan Quinn received 2 years. A 16-year-old defendant was given a 2-year supervision order rather than a custodial sentence, reflecting his younger age at the time of his involvement. The case extended even further into the surrounding community. Parents of some of the gang members, including Mercer's own mother and the parents of James Yates, were later tried separately and convicted of perverting the course of justice, a charge connected to actions taken to interfere with or obstruct the police investigation. The severity of some of these sentences was later reconsidered by the legal system itself. On the 28th of October 2009, James Yates had his original 7-year sentence increased to 12 years. This followed a referral to the Court of Appeal made by the Solicitor General at the time, Vera Baird, who argued that the original sentence had been too lenient given Yates's role in supplying the firearm that Mercer used to kill Reese. The Court of Appeal agreed and extended his sentence accordingly. Mercer's time in prison was not free of further violence. On the 2nd of November 2009, he attacked a fellow inmate named Jake Farey, who had been convicted of murdering a teenager named Jimmy Mizzen in an unrelated case, stabbing him with a weapon that Mercer had reportedly crafted out of a pair of tweezers. Farey survived the attack and was subsequently transferred to a different prison for his own safety. Residents living in the Croxteth area at the time of the murder later said that problems connected to antisocial behaviour in the neighbourhood had already been flagged to parents by local police before the shooting took place. In response to the killing, Merseyside Police designated the area surrounding the Fir Tree pub as a specific zone where officers were given legal authority to disperse groups of people and move individuals away from the location, a power intended to reduce the kind of loitering and gathering that had characterized the area's gang activity. Mercer and the other men convicted in connection with the case were confirmed members of the Croxteth crew, sometimes referred to locally as the Crocky crew, a criminal gang operating in the Croxteth area of Liverpool. This gang had an ongoing rivalry with another group based in the neighbouring Norris Green estate, known as the Norris Green Strand crew, or, in some accounts, the Nogger Dogs. The date of Reese's murder was significant in the context of this rivalry. It fell just 1 day before the first anniversary of the killing of a man named Liam Smith, an alleged member of the Strand crew, who had been shot dead by members of the Croxteth crew as he walked out of Alt Course Prison on the 23rd of August 2006. The full context of what led to Reese's death emerged clearly during the trial. Mercer had been attempting to shoot one or more rival gang members from the Strand crew who had entered Croxteth territory that evening. He missed his intended targets entirely and instead struck Reese, an 11-year-old with no connection to either gang, as the boy walked home from football practice through the same general area. The broader issue of youth gangs operating across Liverpool, and particularly the culture surrounding groups like the Croxteth crew and the Strand crew, drew intense media attention across the country in the aftermath of the case, as the public grappled with the fact that a territorial dispute between 2 teenage gangs had claimed the life of a child who had simply been walking through a public car park at the wrong moment. Reese had been a dedicated supporter of Everton Football Club and held a season ticket alongside his father and older brother. In the days following his death, Everton players laid a floral tribute, along with football boots and shirts, at the scene of the shooting. Fans and players observed a minute-long applause in his memory during Everton's home game against Blackburn Rovers on the 25th of August, just 3 days after the murder. The tribute extended beyond Everton itself. Following a suggestion made by Liverpool Echo columnist Tony Barrett, which gained support among many of the newspaper's readers, Liverpool FC, Everton's local rivals, agreed to play the opening notes of Z Cars, the traditional theme music that greets Everton's own players onto the pitch at their home stadium, before playing Liverpool's own traditional anthem ahead of a Champions League match against the French club Toulouse on the 28th of August. This gesture was followed by a period of applause, and players and staff from both Liverpool and Toulouse, along with match officials, wore black armbands throughout the game as a mark of respect. Reese was buried in a private ceremony on the 6th of September 2007, following a funeral service held at Liverpool Cathedral. More than 2,500 people attended the service. The Jones family had issued a public invitation for well-wishers to attend, requesting that mourners wear bright clothing or football shirts rather than traditional funeral black. During the service, Reese's father, Stephen Jones, read a poem he had written for his son, and former Everton footballer Alan Stubbs read a passage from the Bible. In the years that followed, the Rees Jones Memorial Fund raised money to build a community centre close to where he had died. The Rees Jones Community Centre, located on Langley Close in Croxteth Park, officially opened on the 31st of August 2013, nearly 6 years after the murder that inspired its creation. The case returned to public attention again in 2017, when ITV aired a 4-part television drama called Little Boy Blue, based directly on the murder and the investigation that followed. The drama received largely positive reviews, with many viewers describing it as difficult to watch given the emotional weight of the true events it depicted. However, at least one senior police officer involved in the real investigation raised concerns about how she had been portrayed in the dramatization, stating that certain aspects of her character's depiction did not reflect what had actually happened during the case. Producers and commentators noted at the time that while the drama was based on real events, it remained a dramatized retelling rather than a documentary, meaning specific details had been altered or invented for the screen and should not be taken as a literal record of events. One gang member who had testified against Mercer and the others via video link during the original trial, referred to throughout the legal proceedings only as Boy X to protect his identity, was given the fictional name Kevin in the drama. His real identity has never been made public. Several of those convicted in connection with the case returned to headlines again in the years following their original sentences. James Yates was released from prison in February of 2018 after serving his sentence, but he was recalled to custody at least twice afterward for breaching the conditions of his release license, including once in 2019. Dean Kelly, convicted as a teenager for helping construct a false alibi for Mercer, was also returned to prison on separate occasions after his release, including once in 2013 after a car chase that ended when he crashed into a vehicle carrying a young family. Kelly's life ended years later. He died at an address in Scotland, and a coroner's inquest found that his death resulted from a combination of drugs in his system, including cocaine and several prescription medications. The killing of Rees Jones stands apart from the other cases covered so far in this series in one important respect. Unlike Tommy Comerford, Curtis Warren, or the underworld feud that claimed David Unge's life, this was not a story about rival criminal factions settling scores against one another. It was the story of a territorial dispute between two teenage street gangs, fought with a firearm that should never have been in the hands of either side, that ended the life of a child who had no part in the conflict at all. A senior police officer involved in the original case later described the two gangs at the center of the feud not as organized criminals in any traditional sense, but as young people, essentially children with guns, whose access to firearms turned an ordinary neighborhood rivalry into something that could and did kill. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every figure connected to Liverpool's gun crime history operated within a structured criminal organization built for financial gain. Some built their reputation instead as fixers and enforcers, men trusted to solve problems quietly on behalf of others, moving between different criminal circles across two cities before their own luck finally ran out on a quiet street while walking their dogs. Case 6. John Kinsella, the fixer who couldn't save himself. John Kinsella came from Everton, a neighborhood in Liverpool close to some of the same streets that shaped Curtis Warren and John Phillips before him. Unlike most of the men covered so far in this series, Kinsella did not build his reputation primarily as a trafficker moving drugs or a boss running an organized network. He was known instead as a fixer, someone trusted within Liverpool's underworld to step in and resolve disputes, often relying on genuine physical skill rather than firepower to get results. Kinsella was an expert in judo and jiu-jitsu, two Japanese martial arts built around grappling, throws, and controlled physical dominance rather than striking. That background gave him a different kind of standing in the criminal circles he moved through, one rooted in personal capability rather than the size of an operation he controlled. Kinsella's criminal record stretched back decades before the events that eventually made him a household name in national news coverage. In 1991, he was sentenced at Liverpool Crown Court to 9 years in prison for attempted robbery and for carrying a firearm with intent to commit an offence. This early conviction placed him firmly within the same generation of Liverpool criminals who came of age during the city's shift toward more organised, more violent forms of underworld activity during that period. The event that first brought Kinsella into contact with a much wider public happened in 2001, though its full details did not become widely known until years later, during an unrelated criminal trial. At the time, teenage Steven Gerrard, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated footballers in Liverpool's history and the club's long-serving captain, was reportedly being targeted by a local criminal known by the nickname The Psycho, whose real name was George Bromley Jr. According to a letter written by Gerrard's father, Paul, and later read aloud during a separate criminal trial, Bromley had been threatening to shoot Gerrard in the legs and was also attempting to extort money from the young player as his football career began to take off. The Gerrard family had already contacted police and requested protection, but the threats and harassment reportedly continued for an extended period, creating serious concern for the family and putting pressure on Gerrard during a critical stage of his development as a professional athlete. Facing this ongoing problem, the Gerrard family turned to Kinsella, who had a reputation within Liverpool as someone capable of resolving this kind of situation through direct intervention rather than through the courts or police. According to the account given in Paul Gerrard's letter, Kinsella spoke to Bromley directly and told him to stop the threats and leave Stephen alone. Following that conversation, the family reported that the harassment stopped entirely and did not resume. Paul Gerrard later expressed complete trust in Kinsella's role in resolving the situation, describing the period as one of the most difficult times the family had faced, one that had ended only once Kinsella became involved. This episode remained a private matter for years, until it resurfaced during a separate case in 2008. In 2006, Kinsella had been involved in a robbery in Grantham, a town in Lincolnshire, targeting a lorry depot. The robbery involved the theft of goods valued at roughly £41,000, including items such as Easter eggs, crisps, and household detergents. Kinsella and 3 other men connected to the robbery, James Muldoon, Stephen McMullen, and Thomas Hodgson, were arrested after a high-speed police chase that reached speeds of 130 miles per hour along the M62 motorway near Huddersfield. Hodgson later admitted his involvement in the robbery and pleaded guilty to the charge. Kinsella, along with Muldoon and McMullen, maintained his innocence and proceeded to trial. During that 2008 trial at Lincoln Crown Court, the jury was read the letter written by Paul Gerrard describing how Kinsella had intervened years earlier to protect his son from Bromley's threats, a detail submitted to the court and verified by police as part of the proceedings. This connection to one of English football's most recognisable figures generated significant media attention around the trial, giving Kinsella a level of public recognition that most men in his position in Liverpool's underworld never achieved. The trial itself did not conclude in the way anyone expected. At one point during proceedings, Kinsella was permitted access to the grounds of the court during a lunch break, a routine allowance for defendants who had shown no prior indication of flight risk. Kinsella used that opportunity to abscond, disappearing rather than returning to face the remainder of his trial. The trial continued in his absence, and he was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison, despite not being present to hear the verdict. He remained a fugitive for several months before he was eventually arrested in February of the following year. Kinsella's connection to Liverpool's wider underworld extended well beyond his own individual criminal record. He was a close criminal associate of a man named Paul Massey, a significant organised crime figure based in Salford, a city bordering Manchester. Massey had built a reputation substantial enough that he was once described as Salford's Mr. Big, a nickname reflecting his standing as one of the most significant criminal figures police in the region were actively tracking. Massey's profile extended into a form of public life as well, since he had at one point run as a candidate for mayor in his hometown, a detail that reflected just how openly recognised his position within the local community had become over the years, despite his extensive criminal history. The relationship between Kinsella and Massey was close enough that when Massey died, Kinsella served as one of the pallbearers at his funeral, a role reserved for the people closest to the deceased. Massey's death came first, and it set in motion the chain of events that would eventually take Kinsella's life as well. On the 26th of July, 2015, Massey was shot dead outside his own home in the Clifton area of Salford. The gunman, who fired an Uzi submachine gun at Massey as he tried to get out of his car and take cover, discharged as many as 18 rounds during the attack. Massey attempted to dive behind bins near his home to shield himself, but he was struck 5 times and died within minutes of the shooting. The killing stemmed from a feud that had developed between 2 rival criminal organizations operating in and around Salford. One group was headed by a man named Michael Carroll, and its membership included Mark Fellows and Stephen Boyle, 2 men who would later become central figures in the murder investigations connected to both Massey and Kinsella. The rival organization, which referred to itself as the A-Team, was said to be headed by a man named Stephen Britton. Massey had become something of a mentor figure to Britton within this rivalry, and Kinsella, through his association with Massey, was tied to the same side of the conflict. According to accounts given during the subsequent criminal trial, the immediate spark that ignited this particular round of violence between the 2 groups traced back to an incident at a nightclub, where a drink had been thrown and a woman had been struck during the resulting confrontation, an act treated within these circles as a serious mark of disrespect that demanded a violent response. Almost 3 years after Massey's murder, on the morning of the 5th of May 2018, Kinsella was walking his dogs near the St Helens Linkway in the Rainhill area of Merseyside. He was accompanied by his partner, Wendy Owen, who was pregnant at the time. At approximately 6:45 a.m., a man riding a bicycle approached Kinsella from behind. The cyclist, later identified as Mark Fellows, shot Kinsella twice in the back and then twice more in the back of the head. As Owen fled the scene, she too was shot at, though she survived the attack. The investigation into Kinsella's murder eventually revealed that the killing had been coordinated using EncroChat, an encrypted communications network that criminal groups across the United Kingdom had come to rely on for coordinating illegal activity, believing the system to be entirely secure from police interception. Devices running the EncroChat network reportedly cost around £1,500 for a 6-month contract at the time, and were sold specifically through websites frequented by people involved in serious crime. French police eventually managed to crack the network's encryption, an operation that would go on to expose criminal communications far beyond just this single case. But that breakthrough came after Kinsella's murder had already been planned and carried out through the system. Mark Fellows and Stephen Boyle were eventually charged with the murders of both Paul Massey and John Kinsella, along with the attempted murder of Wendy Owen. The prosecution's case, presented at Liverpool Crown Court, described the 2 killings as connected acts within the same ongoing gangland feud, carried out 3 years apart by the same gunman. Prosecutor Paul Greeny described Fellows during the trial as someone willing to kill for payment, characterizing the murder of Massey specifically as a calculated, premeditated execution rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The trial concluded in January of 2019. Mark Fellows was found guilty of murdering both Paul Massey and John Kinsella. His co-defendant, Stephen Boyle, was convicted specifically for his role in Kinsella's murder, having acted as what prosecutors described as a spotter, someone responsible for tracking Kinsella's movements and location to enable Fellows to carry out the shooting. Boyle was cleared of involvement in Massey's earlier murder. Both men were acquitted of the charge relating to the attempted murder of Wendy Owen, despite the fact that she had been shot at during the same incident that killed Kinsella. Fellows, who had earned the nickname the Iceman within criminal circles because of the calculated nature of his killings, received a whole life sentence for the murders of both men, meaning he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without any possibility of parole and without any minimum term set by the judge, since the sentence itself was designed to ensure he would never be released under any circumstances. Fellows later appealed the severity of his sentence, but the appeal was dismissed, with the court citing the significant degree of planning and premeditation behind both killings as justification for the sentence's severity. Fellows' time in prison following his conviction was not without incident. At one point during his incarceration at HMP Whitemoor, a high-security prison in Cambridgeshire, he was seriously injured in an attack carried out using a blade, sustaining cuts serious enough that he had to be airlifted from the prison to receive hospital treatment. Following this attack, he was later transferred to HMP Belmarsh, another high-security facility, continuing a pattern common among high-profile prisoners whose notoriety makes them ongoing targets even while incarcerated. The story of John Kinsella illustrates a different kind of figure within Liverpool's broader criminal history, compared to men like Tommy Comerford or Curtis Warren, who built and ran extensive drug trafficking operations. Kinsella's value within the underworld came from his personal skills and his willingness to intervene directly in disputes on behalf of people who trusted him, whether that meant protecting a young footballer from extortion or standing alongside Paul Massey as one of the most trusted figures in his circle. That same willingness to embed himself in other people's conflicts ultimately proved fatal when a feud that had originated in a dispute at a Salford nightclub, one that had nothing directly to do with Kinsella's own criminal activities in Liverpool, caught up with him 3 years after it had already claimed his closest associate's life. The use of EncroChat to plan Kinsella's murder also marked an important turning point in how police forces across the country would eventually approach organised crime investigations. The network that criminals believed offered them complete protection from law enforcement interception ultimately became one of the most significant sources of evidence against organised crime groups across the United Kingdom once it was cracked, exposing operations and violent plots that police had previously struggled to penetrate. Kinsella's murder, coordinated through a system its users trusted completely, stood as an early example of exactly the kind of communication that would later unravel entire criminal networks once investigators found a way in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every drug operation exposed through this kind of digital breakthrough involved a single, easily identified boss working alone. Some of the largest and most violent organizations uncovered in the years that followed were run by brothers operating in tandem, splitting responsibilities between them in ways that let their operation grow far larger than either could have managed on his own, right up until the same encrypted messages they relied on to coordinate murder plots ended up delivering them straight into a courtroom. Case 7. Vincent Coggins and the Huyton Firm. The Huyton Firm took its name from Huyton, an area in the Knowsley borough of Merseyside, and for roughly 30 years it operated as one of the most violent and secretive organised crime groups connected to Liverpool. For most of that time, the identities of the men actually running the group remained hidden even from many of the people who dealt with them. That changed only after a police operation cracked an encrypted messaging system the group had relied on for years, revealing that the Huyton Firm had been run by two brothers, Vincent and Francis Coggins. Vincent Coggins operated under the username Moonlit Boat on a messaging platform called EncroChat, a system designed specifically for criminals who wanted to communicate without any risk of police interception. EncroChat sold specialized phones and encrypted messaging services to customers willing to pay for the guarantee of privacy, and for years, thousands of criminals across Europe, including senior figures in the Huyton Firm, used it with complete confidence that their conversations could never be read by anyone outside their own circle. That confidence turned out to be misplaced. French police eventually found a way to break through the encryption protecting the network, and in 2020, they shared the resulting messages connected to roughly 7,000 British criminals with the National Crime Agency. Among those caught in the resulting sweep were Vincent Coggins and the rest of the Huyton Firm's leadership. The chain of events that eventually exposed Coggins as the head of the organisation began with a robbery. On Saturday, the 23rd of May 2020, at around 9:30 in the morning, a young man made a frantic emergency call from a semi-detached house on a residential street in the Liverpool area. He and his father had just been attacked inside their own home by masked men armed with a machete and an axe. When police arrived at the property, they found blood throughout the house, but the two injured men refused to say anything about what had happened or who was responsible. Nobody wanted to talk about the Huyton Firm, a silence that reflected just how much fear the group had built up around its name over the years. What the two victims did not know was that police, thanks to the cracked EncroChat messages, already had access to a private conversation happening in real time among the very people responsible for the attack. Those messages revealed that the house was being used as a stash location for the Huyton Firm's drugs, and that 30 kilograms of cocaine, worth an estimated £1 million, had just been stolen from it. The person giving orders throughout the unfolding crisis, using the Moonlit Boat account on EncroChat, was demanding that whoever had carried out the robbery be identified and killed. When police eventually confirmed that Moonlit Boat was Vincent Coggins, one piece of evidence that helped tie the account to him was a photograph he had sent showing a coffee machine, one that turned out to be identical to a coffee machine police later found inside his own home during a search. The day after the robbery, on Sunday the 24th of May, Coggins managed to obtain CCTV footage of the theft, sourced from a camera belonging to one of his neighbours. The footage showed 3 masked men climbing out of a van, followed by a 4th man carrying what looked like a parcel, apparently posing as a delivery driver to avoid suspicion. Within 4 minutes of arriving, all 4 men had escaped with the stolen cocaine. According to the group's own messages, this footage had actually been obtained by Thomas Cashman, described within the group's communications as a hitman working on behalf of the Huyton firm. Cashman would later become one of the most notorious names connected to Liverpool crime in his own right, convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell, a young girl killed after being struck by a stray bullet during a gangland shooting in August of 2022. 2 days after obtaining the footage, on Tuesday the 26th of May, Coggins ordered one of his lieutenants within the organization to circulate the CTV to everyone in their network in an effort to identify the robbers. Within hours, the group believed they had worked out who was responsible. That same night, Coggins messaged his enforcer, a man named Paul Woodford, describing his intention to use what he referred to in code as a pineapple, a term the group used to mean a hand grenade, to kill the men he believed were behind the theft. Woodford's response confirmed his willingness to take part directly in the killing. Woodford himself had a violent history independent of his work for the Huyton firm, including a previous conviction connected to an attempt to scalp a woman in the UK and a separate case in the Netherlands involving possession of firearms, where Dutch police had suspected him of planning to murder a rival crime boss. 3 days after that exchange, on Friday the 29th of May, Coggins identified 4 suspects he believed were responsible for the robbery, including a local drug dealer named Brian Maxwell and his son, Brian Maxwell Jr. Coggins had gotten it wrong. The Maxwells had nothing to do with the theft. The actual robbery had been carried out by 4 entirely different men, who were later identified and convicted separately after their own EncroChat messages were recovered by police during the same broader investigation. Brian Maxwell Sr., despite his innocence, understood exactly how dangerous it was to be wrongly accused by the Huyton firm. Terrified for his family's safety, he reached out to the group through EncroChat, offering what he described as a solution that would involve him personally covering the cost of what had been stolen, sparing the rest of his family from any consequences. Maxwell Sr. ultimately agreed to hand over £1,360,000 to cover the value of cocaine that he had never actually stolen, a payment made purely out of fear of what Coggins and his organization were capable of doing to him and the people he loved. Coggins accepted the payment and assured Maxwell Sr. that his family would remain safe as a result. At the same time, in a separate message sent to his enforcer Paul Woodford, Coggins revealed his true intentions, stating that he planned to have the Maxwells killed once several months had passed and the situation had calmed down enough to avoid drawing immediate suspicion. Woodford agreed to help carry out that plan. Fortunately for the Maxwell family, Coggins and Woodford were both arrested before they had the opportunity to act on that threat. Brian Maxwell Sr. later pleaded guilty to a separate charge of supplying drugs, unrelated to the robbery he had wrongly been blamed for, and was sentenced to 13 years and 4 months in prison. His son, Brian Maxwell Jr., was jailed for 18 years after admitting to firearms offences. Neither man's actual crimes had anything to do with the cocaine theft that had triggered the Huyton firm's murderous response against them in the first place. In total, 32 people connected in some way to the events surrounding the May 2020 robbery were eventually convicted as a result of the broader investigation. This case represented just one piece of a much larger nationwide effort connected to the EncroChat breakthrough, which by the time the full scope of the investigation became public, had already led to convictions of roughly 1,600 criminals across the entire United Kingdom. A former Deputy Director of Investigations at the National Crime Agency, Matt Horne, later described the scale and violence of the Huyton firm's operation as placing the group among the upper tiers of organised crime in the country, citing the industrial scale of their drug trafficking alongside their evident willingness to use extreme violence to protect their business interests. Horne also noted that the methods the group used to investigate the theft of their own drugs mirrored, in some ways, techniques that law enforcement agencies themselves might use, gathering CCTV footage, identifying suspects, and coordinating a response, except that the Huyton firm's version of that process was aimed entirely at retribution, serious violence, and potentially murder rather than justice through any legal process. The messages recovered from the group's EncroChat accounts also revealed something deeply troubling about how the Huyton firm managed to operate for as long as it did without being dismantled sooner. References throughout the messages pointed to help the group had received from a corrupt individual inside the police, referred to within the group only by the nickname Piggy. Based on the content of these messages, this insider appeared to have provided members of the Huyton firm with printouts sourced from the police national computer, a database containing sensitive information about ongoing investigations, effectively giving the gang insight into exactly what detectives already knew about their operation and their members. Merseyside police later stated that a thorough investigation into this claim had been carried out by the force's anti-corruption unit, and that the investigation did not identify any officers or police staff connected to misuse of police systems in relation to the allegations. One of the most disturbing details to emerge from the recovered messages involved Vincent Coggins personally boasting about an act of violence he had carried out against a local businessman. In one message, Coggins described his intention to torture the man, discussing options that included slashing him, cutting off his fingers, or resorting to other forms of violence depending on how the situation developed. The following day, according to the messages recovered by investigators, Coggins boasted in detail about having carried out an attack on the man, describing having slashed him across the face, damaged his eyes, and removed part of his ear and tongue during the assault. The sheer brutality described in these messages reportedly shocked even hardened rivals within Liverpool's already violent criminal underworld. One anonymous source who knew Coggins well later told investigators working on a documentary about the case that the Huyton firm was deeply hated by many people, specifically because of the extreme lengths the group would go to in order to instill fear and terror in anyone who crossed them. Vincent Coggins was ultimately jailed for 28 years after pleading guilty to charges connected to drug trafficking and blackmail. Several other members of the organization were convicted and sentenced alongside him once the case against them concluded. Paul Woodford, the enforcer who had agreed to help carry out the planned grenade attack and the later killing of the wrongly accused Maxwell family, was sentenced to 24 years and 6 months. Michael Earl, described within the organization as a drug dealer, received 11 years. Paul Fitzsimmons, referred to as the group's money man, responsible for handling the organization's finances, was sentenced to 12 years and 6 months. Other convicted members connected to the same investigation included Darren Tierney, sentenced to 12 years and 9 months for his role in supplying drugs, and Kevin Rimmer, sentenced to 16 years. Details of these convictions could not be made public immediately after the relevant trials concluded, because reporting restrictions remained in place until a separate trial connected to another major figure within the organization, a man named Edward Robert Jarvis, had also reached its conclusion. Jarvis was later found guilty of drug trafficking and blackmail at Manchester Crown Court, after which the full details of the case against the wider Huyton firm organization could finally be reported. Vincent Coggins's brother and co-leader of the organization, Francis Coggins, was not present for any of these initial convictions. At the time these details became public, Francis remained a fugitive from justice, believed to be living abroad, having evaded capture even as the rest of the organization's leadership structure was systematically dismantled through the courts. The two brothers had, according to the recovered messages and subsequent trial evidence, divided responsibility for running the organization between them, with Francis focused on organizing the importation of drugs from mainland Europe, while Vincent handled distribution once the product reached British soil. This division of labor had allowed the Huyton firm to operate on an industrial scale for years, moving quantities of cocaine and heroin valued in the tens of millions of pounds, all while the two men at the top of the organization remained almost entirely unknown to the public. Vincent Coggins's downfall ultimately came not from a rival gang or a planned police sting targeting him directly, but from his own reaction to being robbed. His determination to identify and violently punish whoever had stolen 30 kilograms of his cocaine led him to make repeated mistakes, captured in writing, on a platform he believed was completely secure. He falsely accused an innocent family, extorted well over £1 million from a man who had done nothing wrong, and openly discussed murder plots involving hand grenades, all while leaving a detailed written record of every decision along the way. When French police finally broke through the encryption protecting EncroChat, that entire record became available to investigators almost overnight, transforming Coggins from an anonymous, feared figure who had successfully avoided serious legal consequences for decades into one of the most thoroughly documented organized crime bosses ever prosecuted in the region. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Vincent Coggins faced the consequences of his own messages inside a British courtroom, his older brother remained free for years afterward, moving through parts of mainland Europe, while investigators continued searching for him, unaware that his own eventual capture would come down to nothing more sophisticated than a drunken night out in a small Dutch coastal town. Case 8. Francis Coggins, the international arm of the Huyton firm. While his younger brother Vincent ran the day-to-day domestic side of the Huyton firm's operation across Merseyside, Francis Coggins handled a different, equally critical part of the business, arranging for cocaine and heroin to be brought into the United Kingdom from mainland Europe in the first place. Francis, originally from Stockbridge Village in Knowsley, was several years older than Vincent, and for a long time he managed to stay almost entirely out of public view, running the international pipeline that fed drugs into the organisation his brother then distributed across England, Wales and Scotland. The scale of what Francis Coggins organised became clear only once investigators gained access to the messages the Huyton firm's members had exchanged over EncroChat, the encrypted communications network French authorities managed to crack open in 2019. Once UK police were granted access to the material recovered from that hack, they were able to monitor the group's messages essentially in real time, building a detailed picture of how the organisation actually functioned at every level. Between October of 2019 and May of 2020 alone, Francis Coggins was directly linked to the importation of £16 million worth of cocaine and heroin into the UK, amounting to a combined weight of roughly 1 ton of Class A drugs moving through his end of the operation in just a matter of months. The method Francis and the wider organisation used to move these drugs into the country relied on a smuggling route devised by a fellow Liverpool-based drug trafficker named Christopher Gibney. This method exploited a corrupt insider working at UPS, one of the world's largest international shipping and courier companies. A UPS team leader named Daniel Taylor worked with the Huyton firm to move drug shipments through the company's own logistics network, disguising them as ordinary commercial packages. Taylor would issue what are known as waybills, the shipping labels containing barcodes that link a package to the account of a legitimate business. These particular waybills were marked as already paid by the customer, meaning the business associated with the account would never be billed for the shipment and would have no reason to question or investigate what had actually been sent using their account details. Francis Coggins used waybills linked specifically to the account of the clothing brand G-Star Raw to arrange for packages containing drugs to be shipped to a UPS depot located in Deeside, in Wales. Once the packages arrived at that depot, Daniel Taylor would intercept them before they could be processed through normal channels and hand them directly over to couriers working for the Huyton firm, who would then move the drugs onward into the organisation's distribution network. This method allowed Francis to move enormous quantities of cocaine and heroin through an entirely legitimate international shipping company's own infrastructure, exploiting the trust placed in a major, well-known logistics brand to avoid detection. The recovered EncroChat messages also revealed how frequently and how casually this operation moved not just drugs, but large sums of criminal cash. Messages sent through the network included direct instructions to underlings within the organisation to collect or transport hundreds of thousands of pounds at a single time, treated by those involved as a routine, almost mundane part of doing business, rather than anything requiring special caution, since the group believed their communications were completely beyond the reach of any law enforcement agency. The Huyton firm's international drug pipeline also connected, at least indirectly, to one of the most devastating crimes in recent Liverpool history. Court proceedings later revealed that the organisation had discussed doing business with a Liverpool drug dealer named Thomas Cashman. Cashman would go on to become one of the most notorious names in the city's criminal history, convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbell, who was killed by a stray bullet in August of 2022 after Cashman attempted to assassinate a rival and missed his intended target. According to messages sent between Vincent and Francis Coggins, Cashman had approached the organisation asking for help importing what the messages referred to using the slang term bots, meaning blocks of heroin, sourced from mainland Europe. The messages indicated that Cashman had learned about the Huyton firm's operation through Christopher Gibney, the same man who had devised the UPS smuggling route, and that Gibney was known within the group by the nickname Rubber. Vincent expressed some concern in these messages about how much Cashman appeared to know about their business, telling Francis that while he liked Cashman personally, he did not think Cashman should have that level of insight into their operation, and suggested having a word with Gibney about the leak. Francis Coggins's downfall, like his brothers, began with a robbery neither of them had actually committed. In May of 2020, one of the Huyton firm's drug stash houses was raided by a rival criminal group, and the occupant of the property was slashed with a machete during the attack, while 30 kilograms of cocaine, worth roughly £1 million, was stolen from the location. Vincent Coggins, according to the recovered messages, reacted to this theft with intense rage, demanding that whoever was responsible be identified and killed, even though he did not yet actually know who had carried out the robbery. Court proceedings later established that Francis, who was based in the Netherlands overseeing the international side of the operation, was not directly involved in the threats, blackmail, or violent plots that his brother subsequently pursued in response to the robbery, although he was kept informed of what was happening as events unfolded back in the UK. The actual robbers turned out to have no connection at all to the men Vincent Coggins initially blamed. Investigators later established that the theft had been carried out by a criminal family based in Salford, Greater Manchester, run by two brothers named Jason and Craig Cox, working together with a former customer of the Coggins brothers, a Liverpool-based drug dealer named Richard Caswell. Unaware of this, Vincent Coggins wrongly accused a local drug dealer named Brian Maxwell Sr. and his son, Brian Maxwell Jr., of being responsible for the robbery. Brian Maxwell Sr., upon learning that Coggins believed his son was involved, became so afraid for his son's safety that he offered to hand over property and cash worth more than £1 million in an effort to spare his son's life. Coggins appeared to accept this arrangement on the surface, but in messages to other members of the organization, he made clear his real intention was to still have the Maxwells killed once several months had passed, and the immediate situation had settled down enough to avoid drawing suspicion. As the risk of a full-scale wave of violence across Merseyside grew increasingly serious, police made the decision to move against key members of the Huyton firm before Vincent Coggins could act on his threats. Vincent Coggins was arrested and later jailed for 28 years in 2020 after admitting to conspiracy to blackmail and drug trafficking charges connected to his role in the aftermath of the robbery and his years running the domestic side of the organization's operation. Francis Coggins was not arrested alongside his brother. Instead, he evaded capture entirely for 5 years, remaining a fugitive believed to be living somewhere in mainland Europe, while investigators continued searching for him. His eventual capture came about in a manner that had nothing to do with sophisticated police tracking or international cooperation between intelligence agencies. In June, police in the Dutch coastal town of Zandvoort, located roughly 16 miles from Amsterdam, were called out to deal with a report of a middle-aged man found collapsed on the ground in an intoxicated state. When officers arrived, they had no immediate idea who they were dealing with. That man turned out to be Francis Coggins, 60 years old at the time, finally identified after 5 years of successfully staying hidden from authorities across 2 countries. Detective Chief Inspector Dave Worthington, who led the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit's investigation into the Huyton firm, later described the circumstances of Coggins's discovery as a genuine surprise following months of painstaking investigative work into an organisation that had otherwise proven highly disciplined and secretive in how it operated. Worthington noted that criminals do not typically reach the level of sophistication the Coggins brothers had achieved by accident, pointing to just how organised and careful the operation had clearly been for it to move the sheer volume of drugs it managed to bring into the country over the years the brothers ran it. He described the discovery of Francis Coggins as something close to a fortunate coincidence for investigators, since it was only because a member of the public in Zandvoort happened to report a man in a drunken state lying on the ground that local police ended up attending the scene and were able to identify him at all. Once identified, Francis Coggins was extradited from the Netherlands back to the United Kingdom to face the charges connected to his role in the Huyton firm's operation. He pleaded guilty to conspiracies to import and supply cocaine and heroin. At Liverpool Crown Court, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for his role running the international side of the organisation's business, a sentence handed down years after his younger brother had already begun serving his own 28-year term for the domestic side of the same operation. During sentencing, the presiding judge, Robert Trevor Jones, concluded that both Coggins brothers had occupied positions at the very top of the Huyton firm's organisational structure. The judge specifically noted that Francis Coggins had been responsible for arranging what amounted to almost daily shipments of Class A drugs into the country, along with regularly organizing the movement of hundreds of thousands of pounds in criminal cash connected to those shipments. Addressing Coggins directly during the hearing, which Coggins attended by video link from HMP Manchester, Judge Trevor Jones stated that Coggins had been directing and organizing the buying and selling of drugs on a commercial scale, and that he had maintained substantial links to and influence over others within the wider criminal chain, all carried out with a clear expectation of significant financial benefit for himself. The story of Francis Coggins illustrates just how differently two people running the same criminal organization can be exposed and brought to justice, even when they occupy equally significant roles within that organization's hierarchy. Vincent Coggins was caught largely because of his own reaction to being robbed. A chain of angry, violent messages sent over a platform he wrongly believed was completely secure. Messages that ultimately built an overwhelming case against him once investigators gained access to them. Francis Coggins, by contrast, managed to avoid that same fate for years by remaining physically outside the country and staying largely absent from the specific violent plotting that consumed his brother's attention after the robbery. His downfall came only when an entirely unconnected personal lapse, collapsing in public while intoxicated in a foreign country, brought him briefly into contact with local police, who had no idea, until they checked his identity, that they had stumbled onto one of the most wanted organised crime figures connected to Merseyside. The full picture that emerged from the Hoyton firm case, spanning both brothers' roles, showed an organisation capable of moving industrial quantities of Class A drugs into Britain through the exploitation of a major international shipping company, distributing those drugs across 3 different countries within the UK, and generating enough criminal cash that moving hundreds of thousands of pounds at a time had become an unremarkable, routine part of daily operations for the people running it. That level of sophistication, built and maintained over 3 decades, ultimately proved no match for a foreign encryption cracking operation that neither brother had ever anticipated when they first began building their business together. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every organized crime network exposed through this same wave of cracked encrypted messages relied on drugs moving through legitimate shipping companies or violent revenge plots involving hand grenades. One Liverpool-based operation instead built its entire smuggling method around ordinary household items, hiding narcotics inside cat litter and toilets before shipping them out across the north of England, a method that worked for a surprisingly long time before it too finally came apart. Case 9. Ian Spackman and the cat litter. Cartel, the criminal organisation eventually led by Ian Spackman, did not emerge overnight, and it did not disappear when he was finally caught either. It grew directly out of the collapse of earlier drug operations that had controlled the same territory in and around Liverpool for years before Spackman ever rose to prominence. Part of an ongoing pattern in which one organised crime group after another stepped into the space left behind once its predecessor was dismantled by police. Before Spackman's name ever appeared on a police radar, the same supply chain in this part of Merseyside had been controlled by 2 men named David Hewson and Liam Johnson. Once police successfully targeted and broke up their operation, the gang did not simply cease to exist. Instead, it relocated from its original base in Bootle to a new location on the Hereford Drive estate in Netherton, continuing much of the same underlying business under different leadership. At that point, 2 brothers named James and Kyle Shields took control of operations in the area, running the local drug trade until they too were eventually caught and jailed. Following the convictions of the Shields brothers, detectives working on organised crime in the region were tasked with a specific follow-up mission, identifying who among the wider network of associates connected to Hewson, Johnson, and the Shields brothers had quietly stepped up to take over the next level of the operation. That investigation eventually led detectives directly to Ian Spackman. Spackman was already known to Merseyside police as an associate of both Johnson and the Shields brothers, but at 37 years old, and with no previous criminal convictions on record, he had never actually been flagged as someone involved in serious criminality in his own right. He had, in effect, spent years operating in the background of an organisation that police were actively investigating, without ever drawing direct suspicion toward himself specifically. Over an 18-month investigation, detectives built a detailed picture of exactly how significant Spackman's role in the drug trade had actually become. Investigators established that he personally controlled the flow of up to 50 kilograms of cocaine during the period they monitored him. Cocaine that was distributed not just within Liverpool itself, but out to criminal gangs operating in Blackpool, Barrow-in-Furness, and the Teesside area of Cleveland, spreading his operations' reach across a substantial portion of the north of England. On top of this cocaine distribution network, Spackman had also built his own separate cannabis smuggling operation, working through a front company set up by an associate named Peter Mulvaney to bring cannabis into the country concealed inside ordinary household goods. Using this method, Spackman's operation successfully smuggled in roughly 200 kilograms of cannabis hidden inside cat litter and toilets, everyday products unlikely to draw close scrutiny from customs officials or delivery handlers during routine shipping and inspection. The broader organization, which police said operated on a genuinely sophisticated level, relied on a network of false companies to bring illegal drugs into the country from mainland Europe. Once the drugs arrived in the UK, the group distributed heroin, cocaine, and cannabis both within Liverpool itself and out across a wider stretch of northwest England, reaching customers as far afield as Lancashire, Cumbria, and Teesside. This geographic spread meant Spackman's organisation was not simply a local Liverpool drug ring, but a regional supply network, feeding multiple separate criminal markets across several counties. Investigators gathered evidence that gave a clear sense of just how much money was moving through the operation at its peak. At one point, Spackman was overheard describing how the business had generated £80,000 over the course of just 2 weeks, a figure he reportedly characterised as merely keeping things ticking over rather than representing anything close to the full scale he wanted to achieve, suggesting he was actively looking to expand the operation even further rather than treating his existing earnings as sufficient. The money generated by the operation funded a lifestyle far removed from anything available to someone with a legitimate income at a comparable level. Spackman and his fellow gang leaders spent their earnings on jewelry, designer clothing, cars, and extended luxury holidays, including repeated trips to destinations like Dubai and Thailand. During court proceedings, it was noted that Spackman had accumulated enough financial resources to enjoy a standard of living that would be entirely out of reach for the vast majority of hard-working members of the public, a detail that underscored just how much money had passed through the organization during the period investigators were watching it. Detective Chief Inspector Steve Reardon, who oversaw the investigation, explained that the gang had used a network of false companies specifically designed to bring illegal drugs in from mainland Europe before distributing them within Liverpool and across the wider region. Reardon noted that Spackman, along with 2 other senior figures in the organisation, James Gannon and Tom Collins, had lived lifestyles that most decent, hard-working people could only dream of achieving, but that the investigation ultimately proved that lifestyle would be short-lived, demonstrating that criminal activity of this kind does not pay off in the long run once law enforcement catches up with it. When police finally moved to raid the homes of the gang's members, they recovered goods worth hundreds of thousands of pounds in total, along with £250,000 in cash, seized directly from various properties connected to the organisation. This particular operation also marked a significant moment for Merseyside police in terms of legal strategy. It was the first time the force had used newly available powers granted under the Proceeds of Crime Act to seize goods that officers suspected had been purchased using criminal proceeds immediately at the point of arrest, rather than waiting for a trial to reach its conclusion before pursuing confiscation. Reardon explained that this approach allowed detectives to secure suspected criminal assets right away, rather than risking that money or property might be moved, hidden, or spent before a lengthy court process could run its course. Across the 18 months detectives spent building their case, the investigation resulted in the seizure of heroin, cocaine, and cannabis, with a combined estimated street value of £453,000, representing just the portion of the organisation's total drug supply that police were able to physically recover and document as evidence. When the case eventually reached court, 26 separate members of the organisation were convicted and sentenced in connection with the operation, reflecting just how many people had been involved across the group's supply, distribution, and money handling functions. Ian Spackman himself, identified as the head of the organised crime group and someone who operated the business on a genuinely commercial scale, was sentenced to 17 years and 4 months in prison. Several other senior figures within the organisation received sentences of comparable or even greater length. James Gannon, who managed the actual movement of drugs through the supply chain, received the longest sentence handed down in the case, 22 years, a term that exceeded even the sentence given to Spackman, despite Spackman's position as the group's overall head. Tom Collins, identified in court as third in charge of the organization, was sentenced to 16 years. Peter Mulvaney, the man responsible for setting up the front company, used to smuggle cannabis into the country hidden in toilets and cat litter, received 19 years, one of the heaviest sentences among the entire group, reflecting the significance of his role in enabling the cannabis side of the operation specifically. Mark Campbell, described as instrumental in running the Liverpool side of the business, was sentenced to 14 years. Paul Hornby, characterized in court as a vital cog in the wheel of the operation, received 13 years and 4 months. John Carey, who coordinated the handovers of both drugs and cash between different parts of the network, was sentenced to 11 years and 4 months. Gary Unsworth received 7.5 years, the shortest sentence among those identified as playing a significant role in the case. The organization's reach beyond Liverpool itself was reflected in the sentences given to members based in other parts of the region. Sonny Dixon, based in Nelson, Lancashire, had been part of a group responsible for supplying drugs specifically to the Blackpool area and received 11 years. Robert Tate Potts, based directly in Blackpool and identified as another regional dealer working within the wider network, also received 11 years. Paul Doyle, who worked as a courier moving drugs and cash between different points in the operation, was sentenced to 10 years. Together, these 11 individuals accounted for the most senior tier of the organization, according to the sentences and roles made public at the time, though the total number of people convicted, 26 in all, indicates that a substantial additional group of lower-level members also faced consequences through the same investigation, even if their individual sentences and specific roles were not detailed as extensively in public reporting at the time. The Spackman case fits into a much broader pattern that recurs throughout the history of organized crime connected to Liverpool. Rather than a single, continuous criminal dynasty controlling a particular drug supply route for decades, what actually happened in this specific corner of Merseyside's underworld was a repeated cycle. One leadership group would be built up, operate successfully for a period of time, and eventually be dismantled by police, only for a new set of leaders, often drawn directly from the previous group's own associates and lieutenants, to step into the resulting vacancy and rebuild much of the same infrastructure under new management. David Hewson and Liam Johnson gave way to the Shields brothers, whose own downfall then created the opening that allowed Ian Spackman, previously dismissed by police as a peripheral associate rather than a serious threat in his own right, to quietly build one of the largest drug distribution networks in the region's recent history. The specific method Spackman's organization used to bring cannabis into the country, hiding the drug inside cat litter and toilets, reflects a broader tactic commonly used by smuggling operations around the world. Bulky household goods like these are routinely shipped in large volumes through ordinary commercial channels, giving traffickers a way to disguise the weight, shape, and even, in some cases, the smell of hidden narcotics within products that inspectors and delivery handlers have little reason to examine closely during normal operations. By setting up an ostensibly legitimate company through Peter Mulvaney specifically to handle this kind of shipment, Spackman's organization was able to move roughly 200 kilograms of cannabis into the country using a method that, for a significant period, avoided detection entirely. What ultimately brought the operation down was not a single dramatic event, but 18 months of sustained investigative work, gradually building a detailed picture of drug quantities, financial transactions, and personal connections between Spackman and his co-conspirators, until police had enough evidence to move against the entire network simultaneously. The use of new asset seizure powers during the raids themselves reflected a broader shift in how police forces across the country were beginning to treat the financial dimension of organized crime, aiming not just to convict the people running these operations, but to strip away the visible wealth, the jewelry, the cars, the properties that had made criminal success so visibly appealing to the people involved in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every notorious figure connected to Liverpool's underworld built a reputation through documented court convictions and lengthy prison sentences of this kind. One of the final names connected to this era of the city's criminal history built his legend almost entirely through his own storytelling. Decades of autobiographies and podcast appearances describing a career in armed robbery and safecracking that stretched back to the years immediately following the Second World War, with far less independent verification available to confirm exactly how much of that story reflects documented fact. Case 10. Charlie Sager, the gangster who wrote his own legend. Charlie Sager's story stands apart from every other case covered in this series so far, not because of the scale of his alleged crimes, but because of how much of what is publicly known about him comes directly from his own retelling rather than from court records, police files, or independent investigative reporting. Before going any further, this distinction needs to be stated clearly. Where a fact about Sager can be confirmed through court proceedings or independent journalism, it will be presented as established. Where a claim comes only from Sager's own books, interviews, or a single tabloid confession that was never tested in any court, it will be labeled as exactly that, a personal account rather than a verified fact. Charles Anthony Sager was born in 1940 in Hoyton, an area of Liverpool that would later produce other notable criminal figures covered elsewhere in this series. He came from a Scouse Italian family, and by his own account, his mother ran a respectable fish and chip shop in the local area, giving him a relatively ordinary working-class upbringing rather than any obvious early connection to organized crime. According to Sager's own retelling of his life story, it was through family connections that he was introduced as a teenager to a robbery gang operating out of Hoyton, setting him on a path toward armed crime from a young age. Sager has described, in his own words across interviews and his published memoirs, how he became skilled in using gelignite, a type of explosive, to blow open safes as part of his early criminal work. He has said that he and others practiced this skill at quarries across the northwest of England before moving on to organized robberies and armed heists. By his own account, he was operating as a full-time armed robber throughout the 1960s, going out on jobs carrying a loaded sawn-off shotgun, and he was eventually jailed at some point during that decade after being caught carrying a shotgun during one such operation. This particular detail, that Sager served prison time in the 1960s connected to armed robbery, aligns with the broader reputation that followed him for the rest of his life, even though the specific court records confirming the exact conviction were not available in the sources reviewed for this account. According to Sager, his criminal activity throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s focused specifically on targeting locations known to hold large amounts of cash, such as banks and mail sorting offices, describing his motivation during this period simply as pursuing fast money. He has said that he believed policing became noticeably more sophisticated during the 1980s, making armed robbery a significantly riskier line of work than it had been in earlier decades. As an example of this shift, Sager has described a robbery crew from Hoyton that was caught during a job targeting a sorting office in Worcester, where police were reportedly waiting inside the building when the gang arrived, resulting in one member being shot by a police marksman and the rest of the crew being arrested and jailed. This account, like much of Sager's description of his criminal career, comes from his own retelling rather than from an independently verified news report specific to that incident. By his own description, Sager moved away from armed robbery during the 1980s and shifted his attention toward more conventional business ventures. He has said that he opened a Chinese restaurant in the West Derby area of Liverpool called the Crooked Garden, which he claims was a genuinely profitable business in its own right, separate from any of his earlier criminal activity. The one part of Sager's story that can be confirmed through independent reporting, rather than relying solely on his own account, involves a murder charge he faced later in his life. Sager was accused of the murder of a man named George Bromley, described in press coverage as a feared figure within the local criminal underworld who was killed by a gunshot to the head. Sager was remanded in custody for approximately 12 months while awaiting trial on this charge. In 1997, following a high-profile trial at Liverpool Crown Court, he was acquitted of the murder. Sager has consistently maintained, both at the time and in every subsequent interview reviewed for this account, that he had nothing to do with Bromley's death, insisting that any meeting between the two men that day was simply an informal conversation rather than anything connected to the killing. It was during this period of remand, while awaiting trial for a murder he was ultimately cleared of, that Sager began writing about his life, a process that eventually resulted in his most widely known published work, an autobiography titled Killer. Sager has said that this title was chosen by his publisher rather than being his own preferred name for the book, and he has pushed back specifically against the broader label of contract killer that police and the press attached to him over the years. A label, he says, originated from a comment made by a high-ranking police officer at some point during his criminal career. Sager's book resurfaced in an unexpected context years later, when it was reportedly found inside the home of one of the men accused in connection with the Hatton Garden jewellery heist in London, a major 2015 robbery in which valuables worth approximately £29 million were stolen from a safe deposit facility. Sager has said that Metropolitan Police officers visited his home on Merseyside following this discovery, questioning him about any possible connection to the heist itself. Sager maintains that he had nothing to do with the Hatton Garden robbery and that his only connection to the case was the coincidental discovery of his own previously published book at the scene, connected to one of the defendants. One additional claim connected to Sager requires particularly careful treatment, given both its seriousness and the complete absence of any independent verification. In an interview given to a tabloid newspaper, Sager reportedly told a reporter that he had killed a man years earlier and disposed of the body, describing the killing as something he carried out alone, using a hammer, after catching the man in the act of breaking into a property. According to this account, Sager said he believed the man would eventually have killed an innocent person had he not intervened, and that he had never been arrested or charged in connection with this specific killing, since no formal investigation or missing persons inquiry was ever connected to it in a way that led back to him. This claim rests entirely on a single newspaper interview and Sager's own words. It was never tested by police investigation, never brought before a court, and never independently corroborated by any other source reviewed for this account. Presenting it as an established fact rather than an unverified personal claim would misrepresent the actual level of evidence behind it, and it should be understood strictly in that light, as something Sager himself said happened, not as something independently confirmed to have happened. Beyond the specifics of his criminal career, Sager has spent considerable time in his later interviews reflecting on how he views the broader criminal world he once belonged to. He has expressed a clear distaste for violence directed at women, and has said he experienced genuine fear, describing himself as petrified during at least some of the armed robberies he took part in earlier in his life, a detail that runs somewhat against the more fearless, calculated image suggested by his police-given nickname. Sager has also spoken about what he sees as a decline in what he calls proper gangsters, criminals of an earlier generation who, in his view, maintained a certain code that kept their own local areas relatively free of everyday crime, even while they themselves operated outside the law. He has been openly critical of the drug trade that came to dominate Liverpool's criminal underworld in the decades following his own most active period as an armed robber, arguing that the money and greed associated with narcotics trafficking pushed criminals toward turning on one another in ways that the earlier robbery-focused underworld he described experiencing had not. He has also suggested in interviews that legalizing drugs entirely might reduce the underlying financial incentives that he believes drive much of the violence connected to the modern drug trade, removing the profit motive that currently pushes people toward dealing and the conflict that surrounds it. Following his acquittal on the Bromley murder charge, Sager has said that he considered moving away from his neighborhood out of concern that his continued presence there might expose his neighbors to some form of retaliation connected to the case. According to his own account, rather than wanting him to leave, his neighbors specifically asked him to remain living in the area, telling him that they actually felt safer with him nearby. This detail, like several others discussed in this account, comes entirely from Sager's own retelling of events and has not been independently verified through any other source. Sager has continued to discuss his life story publicly well into his later years, appearing on true crime podcasts and giving talks about his experiences at public events, including one held in North Wales, where he has lived for a significant portion of his later life, relocating away from Merseyside at some point, after stepping back from active criminal involvement. These appearances have consistently reinforced the same broad narrative. A man who grew up in a respectable working-class Liverpool family, drifted into armed robbery as a teenager through family connections, built a long criminal career spanning safe-cracking and armed heists, faced a serious murder charge later in life that ultimately did not result in a conviction, and has spent his later years writing and speaking about that history rather than continuing any active involvement in crime. What separates Sager's story most clearly from the other cases covered throughout this series is the almost complete absence of the kind of paper trail that defined figures like Tommy Comerford, Curtis Warren, or the Coggins brothers. Where those cases could be traced through specific court dates, exact sentences, named judges, and detailed prosecution evidence recovered through methods like intercepted communications or forensic accounting, Sager's story survives primarily through his own voice, told and retold across decades of interviews, a memoir written while he awaited trial for a murder he was later cleared of, and a single largely unverifiable tabloid confession to an entirely separate, uncharged killing. The one piece of his story that can be independently confirmed through court records, the murder charge connected to George Bromley and Seeger's subsequent acquittal in 1997, stands as the clearest anchor point in an otherwise heavily self-authored legend. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.